see all the little emojis coming up, but it's always nice to see that there are people here. Thank you so much for joining me early on in January for this masterclass to talk about the IC trends of 2025 and the ones that actually matter. Now, as is always the case with these, I want to say a huge thank you to the team at Workvivo by Zoom. We've been doing a little bit of work together over the last 6 months, mainly because we came together around about early 2024 and discovered that we have some really strong similarities in our beliefs about the workplace, about employee experience, and about what really matters when it comes to getting that right. Now, I'm going to be spending some time with you today. You do have the opportunity at the end of this masterclass as well to ask loads of questions. So please make sure that you're putting any questions into the Q&A. I have left plenty of time for us to talk about those. And I've also had a look at the questions that you've submitted in advance as well. If you want to be in with a chance of winning my book around leadership, which is called Nobody Believes You, then pay attention today, because I'm going to ask you to share your biggest takeaway from this session, tag both me and Workvivo by Zoom in a LinkedIn post, and we will do a prize draw for that later on today and tomorrow. So let's get cracking, because we have an hour today and I want to make sure that we're starting off well. Now, for those of you I don't know or I haven't met before or who haven't been to one of these masterclasses, my name is Jenni Field and I am a speaker, author, podcaster, researcher about all things leadership, communication and employee experience. I spent the last 20 years of my life talking about communication. I worked inside organizations up until about 8 years ago, where I set up Redefining Communications, which is my consultancy. I mentioned I'm an author. I've mentioned one of my books. I've also published a book about internal communication, which is designed to help you streamline communication to make it more effective and efficient to drive engagement. I'm always reading, so I will talk a lot about books whenever I'm doing a masterclass, but the reading has come in handy today because I have read so many articles and blog posts about all of the trends that are happening in HR, in leadership, in internal communications, so I can understand exactly what's going on for you. I also like a bit of CrossFit and a bit of yoga, very keen on a puzzle, all sorts of things going on in there. I know there might be a chat function, so if you want to use that, please feel free to chat away. Like I said, please ask questions. I'll make sure I get to those. And please also use the reactions for me so I can just see whether or not things are getting a thumbs up or a thumbs down or anything like that as we're going. Just really helps me see whether things are resonating for you. Now, I said I wanted to get started, so that's enough about me, and let's get cracking. So as I said, we're going to be talking about trends. I may say the word trends in quotation marks a lot today, because you'll start to see what the challenge is for us with trends in internal communication as we go through. What I want to talk about is how we can kind of bucket things into skills that we need to learn, but also things that might be part of our strategy and our plan. There's always two different sides to things that we need to look at. So we're going to talk a bit about those. We're going to have a look at what everyone's talking about. So all those articles, blog posts, everything that's been written, I've had a look at those. So we'll share some of those as well. And I've also had a look with some of my team. I've got a data analyst who I work with on a few different projects. And she very kindly had a look at the Gallagher State of the Sector report over the last 9 years to see what we can see from a longer term trend perspective. So I've been working in this industry for 20 years. I've had my consultancy for 8, and I just wanted to look back and see how much really changes, given that every year we seem to talk about trends. So we're going to touch on that as well. So let's get started in terms of trends, predictions, and purpose, because I want to make sure we're starting in the right place. So what is a trend and why do we care about it? So I want to be really clear about this, because we use the word trends quite a lot, and it's not always the case that something is a trend. It might be a priority, for example, or it might just be something that's of interest. But a trend is something that's a general direction where it's going to develop or change. And we want to know what that's looking like. So what's coming down the line that's going to start to change things or start to develop where we're going. The problem for us in internal communication is that that general direction is very much the same every year. Now, that's very boring. And I'm not going to stand here and say, just do the same thing as you did last year, because there are a couple of things that are starting to shift, but there is a need to be very consistent as we go through with internal communication. We have to be consistently good at doing some of the basics, and we have to make sure that we're staying on track with the things that really make a difference, rather than just looking at shiny things that come up. Somebody said in the question submitted in advance, please tell us something other than AI and technology, which made me smile. And I think that's part of our challenge, is we get very caught up in something and we sort of forget some of the foundations, or we just want to focus on something that's shiny. So we'll talk a bit about digital and AI and stuff today, but I want to talk about lots of other things at the same time. So the different trends that we need to look at in internal communication mean we have to look at 4 different areas. So we need to look at internal communication trends, because this will tell us a bit more about channels and content and some of those structural things. We need to look at leadership trends, because internal communication and leadership are entwined. So we have to look at those. Much like workplace trends also have to come in, because we have to look at things like culture, organizational change, all of those things. So those 3 for me are absolutely entwined together. I've had a look at HR trends. I'm not going to really cover them today, just because they're very specific to HR. When I was looking at those, I'm very specific about sort of talent management, organizational design, and skills assessments and things, which I just didn't feel were as relevant for this group. So very happy to talk about that another time, but I've had a look at them and I just didn't feel they were as relevant for this, for us, around employee experience and internal comms. But I have looked at those 3 in more detail, and that's kind of what we're blending together today. But there's a caveat in all of this, which is that there are so many trends, which I will come on to, but I want you to think about the purpose of internal communication in your organization, or for the organizations that you work with. Because the trends that are out there, or the things that people are saying we should be looking at, or the priorities that we need to focus on, it has to be aligned to your organization. It has to be aligned to what the organization is trying to achieve, has to be aligned to your culture. If you just go off over in left field and start doing something that's not completely aligned to that, I'm trying to think of something now, I don't know, doing sort of TikTok style videos with your CEO, that might not align to your culture or your CEO's personality or what you're trying to achieve. It just might not work. So whilst that might be a trend, it's not. Whilst that might be a trend, it's important for us to make sure that it fits with what we're doing. So it's just being mindful of that. So I always come back to, what's the purpose of internal communication in this organization? What is the problem this function solves for the organization? Why were we hired? What are we here to do? All of those things as foundations are really important as we link it into trends. So just to make the point even more, I want to make sure that you're being very clear about the difference between trends linked to channels, content, and strategy, and trends linked to the skills in your team. I want to make sure that your trends are aligned to your organization. So if you don't have a clear purpose for internal communication, then go back and have a look at one of my previous masterclasses with Workvivo, where we talked about internal comms strategy. I think it's one of the first ones we did, where I talk more about purpose and the importance of that. So start there and then bring those in. The trends for internal communication are really broad and really inconsistent this year. There's just loads. So if you start to try and pick all of them, you're just going to be in chaos, and that's not what we want. I spend a lot of time helping people go from chaos to calm, and I'm very, very sure I'm going to do it today. And then the last point there is just about the fact that it has to focus beyond internal comms. What was interesting for me looking at all of the trends out there is they talk a lot about channels and content, sort mainly channels, whereas actually what we're looking at in internal communications is often a lot more than that. Now, again, it depends. It depends how big your function is. It depends if you're a team of one. It depends on how much budget and resource you've got. But everything we do as communicators is a tangible representation of the culture of an organization. So there has to be a broader look than just looking at internal communication. I was looking at something recently posted by the Institute of Internal Communication, where they'd asked attendees at events to share what the profession would look like in 5 years. And it was basically the same as today. It was a lot about channels and just doing the same thing we've always done, which really made me think about our ability to look broader and bigger, and at some of the more strategic stuff that we need to look at when it comes to what we're actually working on to make sure that it does make an impact. So let's have a look at what's coming in the leadership and workplace trends. I feel like some sort of Eurovision thing now. Let's see what's coming in on leadership and workplace trends. That Eurovision will be lost on so many people who are joining from other parts of the world. So we've got 4 of these. So one of them is artificial intelligence. Now, this remains a focus for all disciplines in the workplace. There's a lot to be looked at around AI. So whilst we might talk about it from an internal communication perspective, this has much broader implications for the world and the workplace at large. There is a shift that's coming from Gen AI, which is what we've got now, to agentic AI, which is more advanced and it's more able to solve problems through learning about the environment that it's in. We could get very excited about that. However, as I will say several times today, more people are talking about AI than they are doing anything about AI. But for leaders, it's a big topic. For the workplace, it's a big topic. The other thing that's coming through consistently is employee wellbeing and burnout. So there seems to be a renewed focus on this. It seemed to quieten down last year, definitely coming back this year. So I've picked these 4 trends based on looking at different articles and seeing what comes up consistently in those. And this one does come up. These are all coming up in sort of the same level of consistency, but definitely looking at well-being, burnout, employee experience. What does that all look like beyond things like a fruit bowl and yoga? So definitely much more strategic thinking there. The next 2, so number 3 and number 4, leadership development and culture and hybrid work. So leadership development is coming out through everything in terms of these skills for leaders to be more empathetic, have better communication, those soft skills that we so often talk about, that's coming through. I'm obviously delighted about this, having just published a book about how to be a leader people will follow, but it's lovely to see, not lovely, it's about time that we see that it's being talked about in the leadership circles as well, because I think it's so important, especially in a post-pandemic world. And then the 4th and final one is culture and hybrid work. And I've grouped this together because there's quite a lot of chat about culture, but there's more about this hybrid piece. There's been several articles in the press over the last week alone about the return to office, and there's still continuing conversations about how we operate in a workplace where things are sort of slightly fractured in terms of that. So there's a lot to be done there. And you can see when I list these 4 out, how important that is for internal communicators to understand what these are, because there is a significant role to play. And these are the questions I want you to ask when it comes to those 4 trends, because it comes down to where we started this, which is, what's the purpose of my function? What am I here to do? So as a function, is helping leaders with their communication skills part of your role? Is it something you can influence? What can you do in there? Those are the conversations I want you to have, either as a team, or if you're a team of one, these are the things I want you to go away and think about, work with your coach or mentor on, and just start sort of working them through. As a function, are we clear about the culture, values, behaviours of the organisation? And do we know how we're going to bring that to life through communication, the employee experience? The 3rd one is bringing in this well-being and burnout piece. So this is not really something that internal communicators can get that involved in. So we can talk about the level of noise that we might be contributing to by the volume of content we're sharing, but actually, what is your remit as an internal communication professional in solving the challenges around well-being and burnout in your organisation? Feel free to answer me when we get to Q&A, but I'm not entirely sure what that is. So I want you to think about how we're sort of modelling behaviours, because as a leader, if we're leading the function, if there's no one, if we're leading a team, if we're in the team, how are we operating so that we're managing that? Because a to-do list is a forever to-do list, and a job is a job for hopefully very long term, which means it's never finished. So whilst you may be able to carry on forever, you can't, because you have to stop and do other things in your life. So how are we modeling those behaviors? And then the 4th one is, do we understand AI? And are we making time to use it and play with it? So you can see how these fit into sort of skills, behaviors versus strategy, and how we might pull those into different sort of buckets for us as a function. And I thought that would give you a nice framework to just go away and think about in terms of practically how we can take this away. So I'm not going to talk about trends because there aren't any, and I'll explain that even more in a second. So what I want us to reframe that as is internal communication priorities, because actually it's too hard to start to say these are the trends in internal communication, because when we start to look at the long-term data, you'll see how much things really are fairly consistent and relatively stay the same. So I'd rather we talked about what are the priorities for internal communication in 2025? What are those things that we really do need to be looking at? Now, I've mentioned this already about how many trends there are. There are over 30 different suggestions in the different articles that I read about internal communication. I was blown away by the volume that were on this list, because it's almost like it's just a stream of consciousness from different people talking about what they think is important. And whilst that's quite helpful, if you've got the time to read all of the different articles, there's just so much in there that I don't know how you would be able to say, okay, I'm really clear after reading this what I need to go away and do and what the trends are. Now, I've listed all of these here for you. This isn't even all of them. There were some others. But as I was reading some of the articles in preparation for this, I had to go back to the top to check that we were still talking about 2025 trends, because some of these for me were trends that we probably talked about 5 years ago, if not 10 years ago. And that's where I think it just gets really messy and quite chaotic and very tricky. So when I talk about the fact that trends for internal comms are broad and inconsistent, this is why. There are things like mobile first on here, which I remember talking about when I built an intranet in 2012. There's gamification in here, which I remember talking about in probably about 2014. Frontline workers continues to be a challenge. I'm not sure it's a trend. Measurement will forever be a challenge. Not sure it's a trend. The rise of SMS, that's the one that made me go back and look whether it was 2025, because I remember building a text-based crisis system in about 2009. And then there's things like organizational psychology and things that I think are hugely broad if you're a team of one, a small team with no budget, that just feels so out of reach for what we're able to do. And in my career, I was often a small team, no budget, fought for budget, larger team. It changed a lot, but I'm always thinking about the fact that I was really mainly a team of one, and how was I able to do the stuff I wanted to do in that space? And if I'd been given this list of 30 things that were trends for the year, I think I might go and crawl under a rock, if I'm honest. So I wouldn't know where to start. So that's the 30, and again, not particularly helpful. But what I have looked at is taking some of these. There is probably about 2 or 3 that come out consistently. I've put together a list of 4, I think I've got, in terms of the priorities for us to talk about today. And then I'm going to talk about the action plan that kind of sits behind that, so that we can make this quite actionable for you and quite helpful. What I will say is the reason why I think this is so chaotic this year is because of the pandemic. So just to go back a little bit, when the pandemic was happening, there was a lot of talk about internal communication suddenly having a seat at the table, suddenly becoming the most important thing for organizations. And all of a sudden, this was such an opportunity. Now, when that was happening, I was having some conversations where I was saying, I'm not sure this is going to happen how we think it's going to happen, because what's happening in a pandemic and in a crisis is that the tactical becomes very important. The doing becomes very important. And that's normal in a crisis. A crisis that goes on over a couple of years then starts to sort of maybe feel like that's the norm for what that function needs to do. And that's what we've seen happen. So I've seen some research, probably last year, I think I saw some research from Carrion and Box, which said that the value of internal communication, or the perception of it, was almost back to how it was before the pandemic. So that opportunity, oh, there's so many air quotes today, that opportunity that came in the pandemic wasn't real, because we were forced to be tactical. Since then, there's this sort of need to be relevant and find the value and find the measurement. So what's happening, I think, is that we're sort of throwing everything at it in the hope that something sticks to the organizations that we work with, partly because organizations are in slightly a chaotic state, because How do we navigate how work has changed since the pandemic? How do we navigate the differences that come with this, the hybrid, the frontline workers, the multiple generations in the workplace? Employee experience has exploded in that time. What does that mean? There's a lot going on for leaders and the workplace. And I think we're struggling to find our place in that. So that's where I think this is coming from. Always think it's coming from the best of intentions, but I think that's how we've ended up here. So these are the priorities that I have looked at and identified that are worth exploring for you for 2025. Less is more. Not doing less, not doing more with less. We're not doing that. That's a rubbish idea. This is about less is more. Small things and more focused. So artificial intelligence has to be in there. But this is a skill to look at developing. As I said, there's more people talking rather than using, and it's about having the time to learn and play. If you haven't built that time in for your team, then you need to do that now. There needs to be space to start playing with it. I started playing with it about a couple of years ago. I use it at least weekly, if not daily, for idea generation. We use it for data analysis. We used it for a client where we had 2,000 pieces of feedback on Post-it notes, and we dictated that in and we ran it through AI, and it did the work in half a day that would have taken us probably a couple of weeks. So there's lots of applications for it to save time. Don't be afraid of it. Make space to learn and play with it. And that's the main thing to do with that. If you're already using it, brilliant. But I think we'll find that the majority of people are a little bit scared and maybe just not sure how to sort of use it in the best way. The next is creativity. So this came up in my event, Comms Reboot, which I hosted in October last year. It came up for the last 3 years over there. It comes up in several articles as well. And this is this ability to sort of cut through the noise in organizations. Some of the questions you asked for this event was, how do I get people to pay attention? It came up in some of my previous masterclasses with Workvivo as well. How do I get people to pay attention? And I think this is what we need to make space for as well. A lot of what I'm talking about today is about you creating space to learn, play, and do things differently. If we continue to work at the pace we're doing and just churning things out, nothing's going to change. If we want a different outcome, we have to do things differently. And this is what we need to look at for 2025. So if we're finding that we're stuck in just posting articles online and we're not finding time to develop our skills on creativity, or what does that look like for us? It might be the TikTok videos that I talked about earlier, but it might just be using more visual things, or it might be using more creative language, or it could be just creative thinking to get a campaign really creatively going so that behaviors will change. What are the things that we can do with a bit more creativity? The third is emails. I was quite pleased to see this out there because they were never going to go away. And there's been talk about getting rid of emails since I feel like I was alive, but I've been alive before emails, don't tell anyone. But it feels like they have just been tried to be shunned. And actually what's come through in several of the articles is we need to get better at these. So they are here to stay. How do we use them better? How are we using newsletters more effectively? How are we looking at the email etiquette inside organizations? And how are we doing that as an internal communication team or as a professional? How are we modeling those behaviors? Are we reviewing our newsletters? Are they really for the audience? Or are we just being bombarded by stakeholders who are just telling us what we need to do? So how are we balancing that? But emails and email newsletters are definitely something that need a little bit of attention this year. And the fourth is improving leadership comms. So as I said, this comes up both in internal comms trends and obviously leadership and workplace trends, is these skills, this tone, the communication, the time to communicate, all of those things is really important. And this comes back to your ability to influence that, but there will be some ability to influence that. You just have to figure out what it is, whether it's looking at tone, timing, your relationship with the leaders, whatever it might be, there's definitely a role for you to play in that as well. Now, just a reminder, for any questions you might have, please make sure you're putting them in the questions box so I can get to those in a minute. We're going to have a look at the longer term trends, then the action plan, and then I've got time for some questions. So we should have about 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes for Q&A, which is always my favourite bit. So longer term, as I said earlier, I've had a look at the state of the sector research from Gallagher. For those of you that are unfamiliar with it, it's a report that comes out, I think, around February time, and it traditionally looks at channels, content, priorities, barriers, team size, some of those things for internal communicators. Over the years, it's evolved as a survey, so some of the questions aren't always the same. But what I wanted to look at is what are the consistent priorities and what are the consistent sort of barriers or challenges that are coming up. And there are some, which is good because I did wonder what we might find. So the first thing that you can see over the long term is that it's more about the who, not the how. So when we go back 9 years, there's a lot more about the channels and how we are communicating. Over the years, that has shifted and it's become more about the who, so more about the line manager, the leader, and the leadership. We think that's because of the use of digital tools. So where digital tools have come in to kind of solve those challenges that we have around reaching people, and they've made channels easier in some way, then the person and their skills has become more important. So that's one of the shifts that we're seeing, which I think resonates with what we're hearing about leadership communication skills. There's probably a few of you nodding to this about the importance of line managers. Certainly, I know from my own research, that's something that is so much more important than we probably realise. So that's been one shift that sort of changed over the 9 years, where we can see how things have just sort of altered a bit. There are some constant truths in the data. So for the last 9 years, so 2016, these are the top priorities for teams. This has remained pretty consistent as a percentage answer. Communicating strategy, values, and the proposition, line manager communications, and developing and refreshing the IC strategy. Now, points 1 and 3, I take no issue with, because I think your priorities each year probably are communicating the strategy, values, and the proposition, and developing and refreshing the IC strategy. That's fine. The priorities we've just talked about are things that you can weave into those. So that all kind of makes sense. But I've got a question about line manager communications being on here as a consistent priority for the last 9 years, because not that I feel like we should be able just to tick a box and go, well, that's done now. Yay. But does it still need to be a priority? Have we made any progress in developing line manager communication skills? Because I do really understand the other two are continuous, you're developing them. Are we developing line manager communication skills, or is it a priority because we haven't actually managed to get very far with that? I'd love to know your thoughts on that in the chat, because I'm worried that the reason it's a constant truth is because there's been no movement on that improving, and we haven't managed to make that shift. So I will be thinking about that for some time, but please do let me know what your thoughts are and your experience is, whether or not you think actually it has changed, Jenny. It's just that it's a continuous need to do, or no, it hasn't changed and that's why it's still an issue. So that's our constant truths. Lack of budget has actually grown as an issue over the 9 years, which means we have some big challenges for the profession, and we really have to ask why. And one of the things I thought about as I was writing these slides was, does budget equal value? So if we were given £1 million, does that mean that my function is valued? And I don't know that that's true. And I don't know if we're conflating the two, if we're thinking, actually, if we were given loads of budget, that means that we're valued. And I don't know if that is true. So I'm just going to ponder on that a bit more. And I think it's a question we should all think about, because what's the budget for? What are the risks if that budget isn't there? And what are the alternatives? And I think these are things we have to think about. I was working with a client recently. We were reviewing their communication strategy. So we did a workshop for an afternoon with the team to talk about what I'd discovered in their strategy and had questions for. And then we're starting to rebuild the new strategy together. And in some of those conversations to build the new strategy together, we were talking about this sort of 3-year plan to build the team. And I was saying, oh, I think you just need to start here. I think, putting that in year 3, I think we're just sort of pushing the issue down the line. Let's start with that. And this director of internal comms said to me, oh, they'll just say no. They'll just say no to it. And I said, have you asked before? And they said, well, kind of. And I said, have you done a business case? And they said, no. I said, I think we need to do the business case, because if you came to me and said, can I have X amount of money for a person, and there was no reason for it and a case for it, I would say no straight away. So we have to put the time and effort in for those things, to have that conversation, to be able to talk about the value it brings, why it's needed, the risks if it's not there, all of those things. So, but I come back to this question of, does a lack of budget mean we're not valued? I'm not sure. So again, leaving that on the table. I've got more questions for you, I think, this time than you probably have for me. And the fourth one is disengaged staff, which is really sad to see, but this is coming in as a high challenge since 2016. So it tracks about the same percentage of about 34 to 36% for the last 9 years. But if disengaged staff are a challenge, how do we overcome that? So what's in the control or influence of the internal communication function? And where is that link between communication activity and engagement when it comes to the value of what internal comms is here to do? Because I'd argue that disengaged staff is actually a byproduct of trust in the leadership team. And therefore, the leadership team need to address this. And we can help that by communicating it, but we can't fix this. So if this is one of our biggest challenges and one of our biggest issues, then we need to go and look up, as I say, okay, well, you need to fix this and we can help, but this is on you. Because for 9 years, for this to be the challenge and for us to continue to see engagement sort of not shifting very much, it's definitely not a communication challenge to solve. And this is where the trust piece comes in. So the last one is trust, comes up again and again for communicators to fix, comes up in the leadership community about trust, but nobody's really willing to do it. No one seems willing to actually do the work to get a different result. Because if leaders aren't trustworthy, it means that your engagement will be low. That's why I said there's this connection between engagement and trust. They are interconnected. So we have to be able to address that. If people are saying they want to improve engagement scores, okay, how do we build trust around you and the team? How do we rebuild trust if we need to? There's lots of different things we can do, but if this hasn't shifted in 9 years and the challenge around engagement hasn't shifted, then we've got some work to do to bring those two together and look at how we can improve leadership communication skills, their behaviors that really help create trust. Now, I say that on the basis of my experience and the work that I've done and some of the people I know and have worked with. This might not be in your world, which is why I started this session with all of this has to align to what your purpose is. You might be listening to this and thinking, Jenny, there is no way I'm getting involved in leadership, trust, and how we can do that. That's just not part of my job, and that's fine. But you can take this information and give it to people who do have that responsibility, who are accountable for that and who can help. We don't have to fix everything ourselves. We have a whole organization around us that is here to help. So how do we work with them to help do that? Doesn't mean we have to do it all. There's always a bit of a balance there. So I want to come into your action plan for 2025 based on all of those things so that we can leave this masterclass with some really proper actionable things to take away. Otherwise, I'm just adding to all that noise I said was out there about trends and how we can do things and actually take it back. So number 1, skills to learn and play with. As I've said before, AI has to be on this list, but it will have a larger impact on your organization. So how can you upskill in AI? How can you upskill in creativity? And what does that look like in your role? It's worth going back and having a chat with your team or looking at yourself and thinking about how creative you are. How would you rank that out of 10? How would you rank your AI knowledge out of 10? And then how do you like to learn? Do you need to read books? Do you need to go to online courses? Do you need to go to a conference that talks about it? What are the things that you really want to learn? And then make time to do that. Because if we don't do that, we are going to get left behind. The organization will still be talking about AI. They might be using it, but how the organization uses it is a different thing to how we might use it as communicators. And we have to just be comfortable with what it can do. So make some space for that. The second is about combining culture and communication. So as I've said before, oh, hang on, there we go. As I've said before, communication is the tangible representation of culture. So we have to make sure that our content and our channel strategy are supporting that. So you need to be clear about what the culture is in your organization. What are the values? What are the behaviors? Do you know that? Are you clear on that? Do you know what that means? And then how do your channels and your content align to that? If one of your values is innovation and one of your behaviors is about pushing beyond the norm or something like that, then how are your channels representing that innovative value? How are they doing that? That's what we want to start to see. So it's time to review that and just check and make sure that everything is aligned, especially if we're looking at hybrid and we're looking at that culture and hybrid piece that the leadership are keen to explore. The next two are looking at becoming an advisor and making space to plan. I've kept this very simple because all of those trends that were on that list of 30 all can feed into these depending on what's appropriate for your organization. But we do have to move into that advisor role because you have to be able to advise and support those around you so that you can help them with their communication skills. That might be the leadership team. That might be an HR business partner. It could be anybody around you that you can help them and advise them on the best way of doing what they need to do. Because this has implications for things like your budget, your team growth, it might be a skill for you to develop, whatever it is, but we have to go into that advisor space. I've also done a masterclass on this with Workvivo where we talked about influencing others, and we have to be able to do that if we want to grow the function and if we want the function to be able to operate at that level of influence that we've talked about. And the fourth and final one is making space to plan. Now, I work with teams all over the world, helping them look at their communication. And it's always a little reminder at the end of last year with one of the teams I was talking to was, have you put time into plan? And they were talking about all the things they wanted to do, but they hadn't really carved out a time. And I remember saying to the head of communication, she said, oh yeah, we have got time in. We've got time booked in January. I said, great, how much time have you got? She said, oh, we've got an hour and a half. I know, okay. Let's make that a day, because realistically, this needs to be a conversation between you and the 6 other people in the team. And we need to talk about what the priorities are, when things are happening, what needs to change. If there are things like emails, AI, leadership skills, line manager communication, the things that you're evolving from last year from your plan, we have to make the space to do that. And you can plug in some of the things on that list of 30 if it's relevant to you, but you have to make that space to do that because all of this has to come back to the work that you're doing being aligned to your organization and being aligned to the purpose of what your function is there to do. Because otherwise you're just going to go off and start doing loads of stuff, which will make you feel very, very busy. But actually, is it achieving the goal that we need to achieve? And are we clear on what that goal is? So all of it has to come back to that as well. Now, as I mentioned at the start, you do have a chance to win a signed copy of the book. You just need to share your top takeaway from the session today on LinkedIn. You can add a photo, you don't have to. But I always like to see what your top takeaway is. And then the team at Workvivo by Zoom will do the prize draw, and then I'll sign that and get it in the post to you. For those of you unfamiliar with the book, it's all about the 8 practices of credible leadership and how to be a leader people will follow. Now, before I go to Q&A, I've got another session coming up in a couple of weeks where I'm going to talk about how to prioritize what matters in internal communication. So in the masterclasses last year, so many of you were talking about stakeholders. There's just so much being asked of us. How do we manage that? And I do a lot of work coaching people about boundaries, productivity, how we define that in this world. And how to prioritize things and manage stakeholders and have conversations that allow you to get stuff done. So we're going to be talking about that with lots of tips and tricks in a couple of weeks. But for now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen in the hope that all of this works seamlessly and have a little look at your questions. So don't forget, if you haven't asked any yet, now is the time to put something in there. And I'm going to have a quick glass of water and then I'll have a look. Oh, there's 8 in there. So the first question is, what are some new communication channels that will be good for IC? I don't think Oh, I was going to say, I don't think there's anything new. So I think it depends. Oh gosh, this is going to be a lot of it depends. So I remember, as I've already alluded to the fact that I was here before email. So I remember when social media kicked off and everybody was talking about how we could use Twitter for social media and how for internal comms and how we could do that and how we could, and then there were certain sort of groups that popped up with how we could use that channel for it. I think at the moment we're pretty saturated with communication channels. I don't think we need anything new in the channels. I think it's more about how we use them. So if I think about things like video, where we can traditionally be quite dull in communication and do sort of like a talking head and someone talking in a boardroom office or something. I think there's different ways we can do things and use things a bit more creatively rather than add in new channels. Because I think it's all about having a good channel matrix, which if you are unfamiliar with the channel matrix and you'd like a template, drop me a DM on LinkedIn, as I often say on these, and I'll send you the template for that. But your channel matrix has to show that your channels have a purpose and an audience and a frequency and that's all kind of mapped out. I just don't think you need tons of new ones. So yeah, for me, there isn't anything new that I would want to add into the mix at the moment. Right, there's a flurry have come in. Let me scroll back up to the top. What research would you suggest we look at regarding email use in organizations? That's from Nicole. So it depends. Oh God, I'm going to say this so many times. I'm sorry. It depends on what you want to use it for. So I have done research in organizations I've worked in where we started to look at sort of volume of emails and stuff. To start to look at what we could reduce by introducing digital platforms. So it was all part of the business case for that. I think that I think it's working with IT or the technical team to talk a little bit about what the cost of email is in the organization, because they should be able to talk about that. But there's certain organizations I've worked in where we had rules about emails and ways of doing stuff that I think that was set by the leadership team before I joined it. And they would put certain things in email subjects. So they'd have for information in capitals, and then it would be the subject, or it would be help needed, and then the subject, which meant it was really clear in your inbox what the email was about in terms of what you were needing from me as I was reading it. And there were thousands of us in the organization, but they'd sort of set that norm about how email was used. Not every single one had it, but certainly the help needed was very much used when there was stuff going around, or for information and stuff, which was quite helpful. So for me, it's kind of rules like that. Sometimes people copy in everybody for no apparent reason, and it might be that there needs to be some kind of rules about that. It might be that we don't send emails at certain times. There could be all sorts of things that we look at for those. I know that I email whenever I want to email to my team, but I always say that I don't expect an answer, and we have WhatsApp if there's something urgent. So it's kind of looking at how it's used and doing your own research to see some of that. But I will have a little dig around to see if I can find anything, because I did see some research a while back about productivity and whether we're more productive at home or not. And they looked at some email usage and stuff like that to do that. And it did say that we weren't more productive at home, but that's another conversation for another time. Another question is, if it's true that there has been little to no progress with successful line manager comms, what would your approach be to tackling this as a priority in 2025? Excellent question. So it comes down to what's in your circle of influence or control. So if you have the ability to work with learning and development, if learning and development exists. If it doesn't exist, I would say it's definitely in your camp. But it's about looking at what's the program of development that already exists for managers in the organization, and is there something on communication? When we've done stuff in the past to help line managers, we've just done the 6 keys to impactful communication, which is a sort of a couple of hour workshop. And sometimes we'll look at communication they've sent, and then we'll discuss the principles of communication, and then we'll discuss how they might do that communication differently. So I'm not looking at how to have difficult conversations. I'm not looking at conflict in your team, not that sort of communication, which I think HR will traditionally look at. I'm looking at how do you communicate How do you run a team meeting? Those sorts of things. And so I think you can do it in a fairly nice half-day, couple-of-hour workshop where you can go through the principles of communication. My preference is always to do that with people in a room, because you want there to be more of an experience when you're learning, so that learning goes deeper into you rather than just online learning, which can be slightly more sort of transactional almost. But you can do it online. We've done pre-recorded stuff for people where we've done it. So I always start with your stakeholders for that project. Like, who would you need to talk to? L&D, HR, and then start to build it. But I don't think it's an unfair question to come in and say, what are we doing to improve how line managers communicate? And if there isn't anything, as a team, we can help. If you don't feel that's in your skill set to do that, that's cool. There are people that can help, like me and others who are out there. You might be working with agencies, different people. They'll all have the ability to support with that. Or they can just train you and you can then do it. There's lots of ways to be able to make that a very cost-effective solution without it feeling like it's a huge undertaking. But that's what I would be doing. And I think there's also enough data out there now to say why we need to do that. So if you needed to do a business case, the risks around not doing it would include retention, would include well-being, which we know is a priority for leaders in the workplace. It would also include things like reputation management, because if you do have a high turnover of staff and that links back to the manager, how do you sort of address that and change that? And we just know that the role of the line manager is that link between it all. So I think you've got enough in there in terms of those risks. And that's the organization's decision. They might be okay with those risks and say they're not worried about it. And that's fine. And then we have to figure out whether or not we want to keep fighting that fight and how to do it. Right, next question. What piece of advice would you give a young professional who has just started their career in internal communications to guide them? So I'd always say to them to find a community and a network of people, whether that's on LinkedIn, whether it's coming to things like this and talking to people in the chat and getting connected with people on LinkedIn afterwards. The huge power of networking. There's a huge number of us doing this job. So it's a lovely place to find people on somewhere like LinkedIn. Don't be afraid to ask. Get your foundations right. So make sure that you have the skills in communication. So being able to write, being able to kind of build relationships, like making sure that you've got some of those things. And if that's a challenge, then sort of push yourself into some of those places where you might have to start having some more conversations. But we have to have some of those sort of copywriting foundations in. I don't always say that you need to go and do a qualification. I am qualified in internal communication. I did that in 2012 and did the diploma with the Chartered Institute of PR. And I'm a big fan of that. I've taught on that course since then. But that's not for everybody. But I think it gives you a really good grounding of the theory behind what we're doing. If you don't want to do that, or the investment of that is too much, there's so many books to read that will massively help. I have a PDF that has a big list of books on it. Again, DM me on LinkedIn and I'll happily share that if anybody does need that as well. But I think you have to have a thirst for learning and be okay asking questions and know that you're not going to have all the answers because you're just starting. And I think we have to accept that. I think we live in a society sometimes where we want to be brilliant at everything straight away, but actually we have to learn, and that takes time. We've got another question. How do you measure cascading communications? How do you ensure your message is being passed on to and understood by the masses? It's a really good question and a really hard one to really be able to measure. And it also depends on whether or not you need to measure every single thing. So I always talk about whether you want people to think something, feel something, or do something with your communication. If you're clear on that, measurement can become a little bit easier. So if you know that you need them to do something, then you can measure what they've done. So if, for example, you have to communicate to a whole building that the entrance is moving from A to B. I did have to do this once, it's always my example. And maybe both of them are open for a while, or you just need them to start moving, or actually A is remaining open, but you just can't use it anymore, which was what we had to do. You have to use B. And your measure is in whether or not people are using B. So it doesn't always matter whether or not someone's read that article, it's are they doing what you need them to do? If the communication is there because people need to know that, they just need it for information, they don't need to do anything, then it's about making sure that why they need to know that information. What's the impact of it? Do you need to measure that? Like, does it matter if they don't know it? Is it going to have an impact if they don't know it? But we would sometimes do things where we would make sure that we're communicating the same thing in different ways in different channels. So we never looked at channels as individual things. They were always integrated. So things would link between them, which would mean that you're hitting people lots of different ways. But I always want to come back to what is the outcome we're looking for from the communication, and then what's the measured impact of that. Because if it's just that you need to communicate that, you know, Bob's left and Sandra's joined, you know, does it matter if not everybody knows that? How important are Bob and Sandra to that individual or that team, and how important is that to know? So those are the things to look at. I think if you've got digital platforms, it's easier because you can check whether things have been read, seen, and stuff like that, which makes it a bit easier. I'm thinking of sort of that frontline deskless workforce as well, which was always my core audience and quite challenging. So yeah, that's what I would look at. What would be some strategies to rebuild trust around leaders? Great question. It depends, as is my answer of the day. It depends on how the trust was broken. And it depends whether people want to rebuild trust. Both parties have to want to do that. But it's about doing what you say you're going to do, being open and transparent, and making time for people. So if leaders really want to rebuild trust because it has broken, then they have to give it time, and they have to give time face to face. There's data that shows that face to face is the best tool for building trust, better than video stuff as well. So it has to be time, it has to be in person, and there has to be action that follows that. So if they say they're going to do something, they do have to then do that. And it has to be continuous, because it depends whether the trust can be rebuilt. That's very personal as well. So there will be employees where trust might break and that employee will leave because they don't feel the trust can be rebuilt, and that's okay. That happens, that's our decision. But I have got a couple of blog posts and some podcasts on some strategies to rebuild trust, so I can share those with you. And if you want to drop me a DM on LinkedIn, I can just pop those in for you so that you've got those straight away. Another question: any tips on developing an IC comm strategy when there is no business strategy? I always enjoy these. So I love that someone's replied saying this would really concern me. So I've been here. So I have joined an organisation, and most of my career has been joining organisations to set up an internal comms function. So you're often going in where there's all sorts going on. And there wasn't really much of a strategy. And we had to do a conference. I think I joined in the March. We had our store manager conference in the November. And I remember thinking, I don't know how I'm going to create this content because I don't know how to do it. And I ended up doing it sort of retrospectively. So I ended up going and talking to all of the leaders about what was important to them. What were your priorities? What are you working on? What are you doing? And then I could then start to build that into sort of buckets of stuff into strategies, and then I could do it that way. So I reverse engineered it for them to do it that way. That's what I would be doing. So I would be going and having all those conversations, finding out what they're doing, and then putting that into a communication strategy and then playing it back to them so that they had that sort of clarity. It depends on the size of the organization why there isn't one. It's not a conversation for today, and I'm not going to ask Anne-Marie to share any more of that. But that's what I would be looking at. Do it from the other way around. Lots of conversations, and I promise it does all come together. All right, I've got 5 minutes left. We've got a question. I noticed there wasn't anything on inclusion and belonging, unless I missed it. Why is it, do you think? So we did have inclusion on the list of like the 30 trends that were in there. It's come up a couple of times. It doesn't come up anywhere near as much as it did, I would say, about 4 years ago. I wonder if, as an evolution, it's coming into the well-being space. I'm not sure that's right, but I wonder if that's where it's going. I think people are quite nervous about talking about diversity and inclusion, because I think we're seeing a lot of stuff in the press at the moment from Meta and different organizations making some very bold choices on things. And I think that's making everybody just go a bit quiet. And I think we just, as humans, have a tendency to go a bit quiet when we're not sure what to do. And I think that's possibly what's happened. I don't think that it's not happening. I think it's just that we're not sure what needs to happen, and therefore it's just got a bit quieter. But there was a bit more talk about belonging. Inclusion was on there. As I said, I feel like it might be coming into that well-being piece, which isn't right, I don't think. But it could also be a positive step in that it's just being absorbed more into overall culture and looking at culture as a whole. And that would be hugely positive if that might be where it's going. But I think we kind of have to wait and see what happens over the next 6 months in terms of the political change that's going to be happening around the world and see what impact that has. I know from the friends that I have, my best friend Advita Patel, she works in this space, and I know she's still quite busy and doing work in that. And I know there's still a huge demand for that support on inclusion and belonging. So I don't think it signals that the demand has gone away. I think it just signals that people are being quiet about it because they're just not sure what to do. Right, another question. What words of wisdom, oh, this is putting the pressure on, would you give a company that wants to launch an internal communications program for the very first time? So I would tell them to, or words of wisdom, I feel like that needs to be really short and snappy. I would tell them that they need to look at what the business is trying to achieve, what are the stories they need to tell about that, and what do they want people to do as a result, and how do we want to reach them? I wouldn't make it any more complicated than that, because that would give you your channels and your content strategy, and that's ultimately where you want to start from. But I'd probably tell them to watch my previous masterclass on how to do an IC strategy with the team at Workvivo by Zoom, because it's all in there as well. Right, I've got 2 minutes left. There's a question about ideas for gamification. Someone's answered that, which is fabulous. I'm going to go and look over some blogs on gamification because it's been a conversation for a good 10 years. So I think if you had a look, there's probably some really good examples out there. Sophie's asked, what would you prioritize for 2025 as a team of one, struggling to manage the business as usual strategy and transformation projects? I would say to take time out to plan. I would absolutely clear a day, go into a room and sit with, which is what I used to do. I would bring in some outside help for me because I like to bounce things around, but I would have flip charts around the room, which were every month. And then I had post-it notes of stuff. And then I would sort of put it up with what I was doing. And I might have different post-it notes that were color coordinated to different stuff because I'm just that person. But it would allow me to visually see what was going on. And I would do that planning once a year. I'd try and do it once a quarter, but realistically, it was kind of a once a year thing. If you're struggling and feeling very overwhelmed, then that's what we need to do. The next masterclass I'm going to do in a couple of weeks on how to prioritize will give you loads of other tips and stuff to look at in terms of managing attention, how to do stuff a bit differently, and how to manage stakeholders. That will probably be really helpful as well if you can join me for that too. And that nicely concludes our time today. So thank you so much for coming. I will have a look at all the questions that you submitted. I'll have a chat with James and the team at Workvivo to see if I can have a look at all of those and see if I'm able to answer them either on LinkedIn or on some blog posts. If you had a burning question and I didn't get to it, as I always say, drop me a DM on LinkedIn and I'll voice note you back, or I will write you back depending on the complexity of your question. But thank you very much for joining me. Have a lovely afternoon, evening, day, wherever you are in the world. Always a pleasure. And I will see you in a few weeks. Thank you very much.